Today's episode of The Buff is sponsored by SitRep. SitRep is an notorious open source intelligence app that provides the latest updates for over 180 countries and over 500 topics, allowing you to stay ahead and informed. Now available on Apple and Google. Thank you, SitRep, for sponsoring this episode. Welcome to the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias, and today we are joined by our regular guest and friend, John Larir, also known as Defense Bulletin, to go over the latest on the Iran-U.S. negotiations and the broader conflict impacting the Middle East. John, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me on again. It's great to talk about Iran again. I think that's what we spoke about last time I was on here. And the dynamic is vastly changed since now we're in the middle of these negotiations, or what I like to call nominal negotiations, because they're kind of off and on every couple of days or couple of hours as we see it. But yeah, it's great to be on. Thanks for having me.
Now, John, you're at this point you're a regular contributor, and at this point, like I would even call you an honorary co-host of the show, because obviously the military component related to this, the diplomatic component, is very important, and we want to go there. But before we do, I do want to share some breaking news that kind of broke right before we recorded, that I think has very important implications for the United States. And that is that right now there's presidential elections in Colombia, the next round of elections. The candidate endorsed by President Trump, the far-right presidential candidate, Abelardo de la Espriella, he won. Apparently, the initial counts indicates that he has been elected the next president of Colombia. That is very significant with the whole U.S. focus on the Western Hemisphere and the shields of America. We still have to wait for the official announcement by Colombian authorities. Obviously, this is not very happy for the current Colombian president, President Petro, where his candidate, the kind of the left-leaning Communist Party political candidate, has not won the round. And it looks like we're going to have a pro-American president in Colombia who will more than likely expand not only kind of U.S. military footprint in Colombia, but wholeheartedly be part of Trump's Western Hemisphere focus, the Monroe Doctrine, not only against organized crimes and cartels, but Chinese influence and even Russian influence in the region. So this is a significant development. We do plan on doing an episode next week, recording it next week, to actually go into detail of this, covering the Monroe Doctrine, covering U.S. Broadly's interest in the Western Hemisphere, and how a conservative wave sweeping South America is benefiting U.S. national security interests. And I think the militarization on the war on cartels, or the war on drugs, or whatever term you want to use, is something that is going to continue to expand with the election in Colombia, because this is just one of the latest in many elections where conservatives have been elected. And these conservative candidates are extremely pro-American, kind of well within the political camp of President Trump. But I do believe this even transcends this American political system, but it has broad national security aspect regardless of who is the president in the United States. So something to look forward to next week. But John, as you said before, I kind of gave that breaking news in Colombia. You quickly alluded to this. I mean, it feels like every day, every hour, there's shifts within the information space of what's going on between the United States and Iran. Again, we're recording this episode on Sunday, June 21st. And right now, the negotiations on the U.S. side is led by the Vice President J.D. Vance, and by the Iranians, by the Speaker of Parliament, Ghalibaf. There's negotiations now that the MOU was signed on 17 June with the 14 points. Now they're trying to get more into details. There still seems to be very important sticking points. Iran and the IRGC yesterday claimed the Straits of Hormuz was closed, although traffic apparently has kind of increased maritime-wise. We haven't really seen a dent in the maritime traffic. The main impediment does look like Israel operations in Southern Lebanon against Hezbollah. And so there's a lot of back and forth that kind of puts into question the validity of the MOU, the validity of ceasefire. And it seems like we're getting more rhetoric, and in a way, especially from the Iranians, propaganda and information warfare. And I hate to use this term in a kind of at least in a professional podcast, but vibes, if it makes sense, from the Iranians to try to show, at least in the publicly, that they have the upper hand, while maybe not really laying out if there's any substantive advancements. And we really don't have any reporting, although both sides have claimed negotiations are continuing. It looks like there's a lot of issues. So, John, I guess my first question to you, I'm going to leave it broad because I do believe there's a lot to talk about. I mean, what's the confidence level you have in these negotiations and the MOU? Do you think that this 60-day period we might see an extension of ceasefire, or do you believe military conflict might resume pretty quickly?
Yeah, thanks. I think it's a good question. I think that my confidence level right now is pretty low, but I'd say it's low to mid right now, right? And simply because of the lack of political will within the Trump administration to resume large scale conventional, large scale combat operations against Iran, that are extended here. We saw them be willing to conduct a resumption of kind of limited strikes against Iran, and not as widespread. Obviously, we saw they were largely sequestered to coastal cities, certain areas in Tehran. We didn't see them reach into the central and eastern areas of Iran like we saw during the 40-day war between the U.S. and Iran and Israel. I just don't think the political will is there. We've seen key assets moved out of the region, although bombers do remain stayed pre-positioned in areas like the UK and elsewhere, specifically B-1 bombers. But I just don't see the political will there to kind of resume the high tempo operations against Iran here. But kind of on the flip side here, I don't see this current dynamic lasting too much longer. I think we kind of have this untenable peace here, if you could call it that way. We've kind of had this ceasefire for the past month or so, that has included both sides firing at each other dozens of times, right? And so either something's going to break here or something's going to be realized here. And I think we're the closest we are in the past week to realizing some type of long-term ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran that's been brokered by both Pakistan, Qatar, Turkey, Egypt, even, and other Gulf nations, including Saudi Arabia as well, who is historically kind of an adversary, the geopolitical adversary to Iran. I do think Iran wants out of this too, but they understand that they hold a lot of the cards here, specifically being the Strait of Hormuz here, locking that down. And then Donald Trump will, in turn, when they do that, then he says, "Oh, I'm going to lock it down," like a double blockade here. We saw that him impose that blockade on them. And so Iran is looking to gain a couple things from these negotiations, with the understanding that they hold leverage over the Strait of Hormuz, and the U.S. is unwilling to accede to certain things. Obviously, the nuclear file is one of the biggest things on the U.S. list, obviously, because that's a big point of contention for Bibi, right? The idea that Iran can never have a nuclear weapon, or that Iran enriched material must be destroyed and or diluted. Iran publicly says that they won't accede to these, but then, at the same time, we see other reports from U.S. officials saying that, well, behind the scenes, they're saying the exact opposite. And so I just don't think that with the way that negotiations are going, where every couple hours it sounds like either the negotiations are failing or they're doing really good. I just don't see this being tenable long term. Obviously, this isn't going to last. Not only is the U.S. and or Iran just going to get wholesale altogether tired of this, but also regional powers and global powers will eventually get tired of this. And we're going to increasingly begin to see global pressure on both the United States and Iran to kind of actually realize some level of a tenable ceasefire here. But as of right now, I think that the likelihood of realizing one is low if the current dynamic remains the same. Obviously, there's a bigger foiler here. That's Israel. That I touched on Bibi before. We've seen Iran draw red lines very publicly, and then within days and or hours, Israel will kind of go against those. Now they're using strikes from Hezbollah, Lebanese Hezbollah, that is, as justification for some of these strikes. But even Donald Trump, President Trump himself, has even said that, well, their implementation of some of these strikes and the implementation of some of their operations here is kind of is wanting when it comes to kind of the allocation of fires here, right? Trump himself said, they're looking to get one guy and they drop a whole building full of people. Obviously, optically, that's not very good looking for them. And so specifically what I'm talking about earlier, though, with Iran drawing red lines and Israel kind of crossing them, seemingly on purpose, right, is, Iran said, do not strike this neighborhood in Beirut, the Dahia neighborhood. And the next day, Bibi ordered strikes against Lebanese Hezbollah targets in that exact neighborhood. And then we kind of saw that resumption for the 2-day resumption of strikes, of reciprocal strikes again between Iran, Gulf nations, and the United States for about 2 days, and then Donald Trump announced yet another ceasefire, probably like the fourth one. And so, like I said earlier, Israel's kind of been the biggest foiler so far in this, and that's really only because Iran has tied a ceasefire between Israel and Lebanese Hezbollah to a ceasefire between them and the United States, which was always going to happen as well, too.
Actually, I do want to, kind of pull a couple of these threads that you said and go one by one, right, in some of this, right? But one of the interesting aspects before the MOU was signed is you kind of alluded to that the U.S. conducted strikes against Iran for, continuation for like about 2 days straight. And it looked like there was going to be an expansive campaign until the MOU was agreed upon. And it did show that at least the second day of strikes, that the U.S. was doing this not in retaliation to, let's say, the downing of an AH-64 Apache helicopter, but more because the patience was wearing thin for Iran not to agree with the MOU. What I found very interesting in the reporting, though, was that, and Vice President J.D. Vance has kind of said this, is that there was the MOU that was released publicly, and some of the wording of it and how they're trying to frame it, and I would like to ask this to you directly, was the way that it was worded was to enable the Iranians to claim a win domestically, right? To sell it to the domestic public, right? Because one of the key components, for example, they said, well, Iran can't put tolls along the Straits of Hormuz for 60 days. The Persian Gulf Authority, that's kind of the Iranian-backed entity that is going to kind of manage, quote unquote, the Straits of Hormuz, released a statement saying, well, for 60 days, Iran will bear the cost, would foot the cost of these tolls. And President Trump today said, Iran is never going to put tolls in the Straits of Hormuz, and if anything, the U.S. would, right? So my question to you, John, is, it was very interesting after 2 days of U.S. strikes, followed by that previous weekend Israeli strikes, the momentum shifted to Iran saying, okay, we're going to agree to the MOU. So my question, John, is, do you think that the U.S. is maybe giving leeway to the Iranians, specifically to Ghalibaf, so that he can sell this internally inside of Iran? Because, again, it's important to note there's a lot of criticism that Ghalibaf and other elements of the Iranian government are suffering and facing from hardliners within Iran because of these negotiations. IRGC has been wanting to officially close the Straits of Hormuz, not just rhetorically, but actually officially, because of Israel's operations in Southern Lebanon. And yet it hasn't, although they kind of announced it, they haven't really done anything to reclose it, and traffic and maritime traffic is continuing. So do you think, John, the United States, led maybe by Vice President J.D. Vance, led by Steve Witkoff, Jared Kushner, is trying to give Ghalibaf some avenues to claim a win, regardless of how that might look to the United States or maybe impact our public image?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what's going on here. I think the most recent evidence of such a dynamic here is after today's negotiations, the Iranians claim that the nuclear file was not even mentioned at all, and it won't be coming up yet in the negotiations process. But the Secretary General of the International Atomic Energy Agency was invited to the negotiations today, and it was there and was expected to have some level of bilateral or trilateral talks with both sides on the sidelines of the wider negotiations here, right? So both can't be true at the same time, right? The nuclear file had to be talked about if he was spoken to at all, right? You know what I mean? And so I do think that is happening here. Also, earlier this week, we saw reports, and I think this is sort of what you were alluding to, reports that the exact version of the text is just really allowing the Iranians to kind of say what they want here. And obviously we saw a bunch of different versions of the text. I think the first version we saw was from Iran's state-backed Mehr news agency, I believe, which was ironically very close to what ended up getting released as well here. And I do believe, though, that there is an understanding that Iran has a significant amount of face that they have to save when it comes to their domestic population and domestic audience here, as does the United States here. But
Iran, John, if I might jump in, though, one of the key aspects that we're getting additional reporting is there's things that were agreed upon that are not in the MOU, and it's, I guess, it's an open question. Was this a gentleman's agreement verbally? But there was even conversations. Well, there's kind of these amended, appendices or annexes to the MOU where the Iranians have signed it, but it just wasn't publicly released. And I think it's to your point, John, is I think the United States acknowledges, we can't right now put too much because let's be absolutely real. I think the biggest concern if you're Ghalibaf or you're looking at the Iranian picture is, I mean, a coup led by the IRGC. And so it does look like there's some sort of secret agreements that haven't been publicly released.
Right, exactly. And there were also reports that the new Supreme Leader, Mojtaba Khomeini, did not want to even approve the deal, but kind of acceded to it anyway, regardless of whether or not he got pushback from the IRGC, who ostensibly is really kind of the one running the game right now, at least domestically inside of Iran. And so I personally, I think that though this will hamper the process down the line, right? Because at the end of the day, the U.S. is Donald Trump. We've kind of seen him go and rant and rave on Truth Social here every time Iran does something else, or Iran says that this is what's happening, or Iran claims to close the strait here. But I just don't see how long this is going to last. They're going to be able to keep pulling this or keep giving them such a wide bandwidth to kind of say whatever they want or to characterize the negotiations however they want. Because if they're beginning to agree to things and then they're not implementing things because they said, well, it's not in the publicly released MOU. And then we say, well, but you agreed to this in some gentleman's agreement that no one knows about. You can kind of see how that's going to be a slippery slope here for Iran to not implement their side of the deal that they've agreed to here. And at the same time, the U.S. could do the same thing here. But I think Iran is the one who's already been given the long leash here. And so they're going to keep running until somebody kind of reins that in. Now, whether or not that's going to happen at this round of negotiations or a further round in the next 60 days, if the ceasefire holds, right, or the nominal ceasefire holds, that remains to be seen. So,
all right. So I guess my question then, John, is could the Iranians then be playing basically a version of good cop, bad cop, but they're on the same side? And what Iranian Foreign Minister Arachi kind of released in a book saying that, the Iranians negotiate, but really the end goal is to continue to move along with their overall objectives and just negotiate for buying time. Is there a possibility that maybe President Trump and more importantly, Vice President J.D. Vance might be falling into an Iranian trap where they're just negotiating, trying to hope for a better outcome down the road? Maybe the midterms, where the Democrats might seize control of either the House or the Senate. Maybe President Trump has another political crisis. Is there a possibility that maybe J.D. Vance might be running into an Iranian trap where they're just negotiating, but not really in good faith?
Yeah, I mean that is a possibility, but personally, I don't think President Trump and other officials within the administration, including Vance, don't have the patience to wait till midterms. Right? I do think they want to wrap this issue up. We have other issues. There are other issues that they would like to get to, i.e., Cuba and other areas in the world, i.e., China. But I think Cuba to them right now is more pressing that they want to get to, and I don't see them waiting till the midterms to, kind of let the Iranians string us along that long. I honestly would assess personally that we begin large-scale combat operations against them again before we let them string us along for that long. Now there is some level of seriousness to the Iranian endeavors here, though, because but you got to look at what they're looking for, kind of in the same manner that the Russians, when they came to the Ukrainian negotiations, where they brought Kirill Dmitriev, who was their kind of their sovereign wealth fund director. And the Iranians also brought their central bank governor to these negotiations, which is pretty telling on what they're looking for out of this. Obviously, they're looking for some level of economic concessions or financial concessions here, which is what they've been saying all along here. Right? There's been three main things that they say have been violated, at least in the past week for the MOU, and that's been Lebanon, which we kind of just mentioned, and Lebanon, the U.S. presence still in the Strait of Hormuz, because the U.S. says we're continuing to guide ships through the Strait of Hormuz, to provide safe passage. And then the third thing that I personally think they're most worried about, but they're not going to say this out loud, is the sanctions waivers and financial, for lack of a better term, I would call reparations. And so they brought their central bank governor along. So I do. There is some hope there that I think the Iranians are serious about getting something done in this round of talks. But like I just said in the last question, that remains to be seen if we can stop getting all these kind of hiccups in the talks, such as Donald Trump, directly threatening the negotiators as they're negotiating, and or Israel conducting escalating operations in Lebanon.
Well, it's interesting that we saw the quote. I believe it was President Trump to Fox News when they were asked him about the Iranians, saying that they closed the Straits of Hormuz. He basically threatened not only that he would destroy Iran and they wouldn't have a country left, but even the negotiators said you won't, explicitly be able to go back to your own country. And
Right.
the Iranians responded, we're not going to, and we're walking out of the negotiations because of the Trump threat, and we demand an apology. And they were still negotiation. And again, it goes back to that information warfare and that propaganda aspect, right? Where no, they said they walked out and they demanded an apology before the negotiation continued. That was a flat out lie. The negotiations were happening continuously between the United States and Iran and Switzerland. John, you mentioned Ukraine. And I would love, before we wrap this episode, maybe the second half, to talk about Russia, Ukraine, because I think there's a lot of military components that are there from the drone aspects and the front line, broadly speaking, and especially the fuel crisis in Crimea. So I'd love to talk about that and then kind of the later half of this episode with you from a military component, because I think there's a lot there that I think a lot of people are sleeping through. But before we go there, you brought up, I think the main impediment of the negotiations is Lebanon, right? And the idea that, I mean, we continuously see the Iranians publicly claim that Israel's operations in Lebanon are a red line. Not only do they want a ceasefire, but they've even said that they won't really negotiate anything outside of the MOU without an Israeli withdrawal in Lebanon. They're leveraging the first point of the MOU as a U.S. commitment to reign in Israel and even force Israel to get out of Lebanon. Look, my personal opinion, if the negotiations are continuing on in a positive route, I don't necessarily see the Iranians, especially if they're going to get good sanction relief and an investment fund where they're going to have to give up aspects of the nuclear program. I don't necessarily see them derailing that for Hezbollah, just to be clear. That's just my personal opinion. But I do agree with you that this is the main impediment. This is one of the main aspects that the Israelis have been very clear that they will not acquiesce to President Trump or the Iranians' demands, that both Hezbollah and Israel both publicly claim that they support the ceasefire, that the ceasefire is in effect, but fighting continues and everything else is going on. As kind of the Middle East writer for OSINT Defender and his team, my question to you directly, John, is, I mean, from a military component, what is the keynote news that you've seen in the last 48 hours, 72 hours? Because there was a lot of clashes going on in southern Lebanon, airstrikes, etc., that really put the negotiations at risk. So what's the latest that's going on in southern Lebanon between the IDF and Hezbollah?
Well, I think the latest is that they're continuing to take casualties, which I think is something that has been getting glossed over a little bit here in the past weeks, as kind of the Lebanon southern Lebanon situation is kind of overblown by the ongoing talks between U.S. Iran and or strikes between U.S. and Iran. And it's the IDF, the casualties they've been taking in southern Lebanon was increasing steadily for a while, and a large portion of these casualties were due to FPV drones. Hezbollah has, I mean, a year ago, if you had told me that Hezbollah would be using FPV drones at the capacity that they are right now, I'd be telling you, well, we haven't seen that we're not going to see that because they haven't. But the kind of up tempo in the use of FPV drones has been extremely significant, and be using them to great effect. Not only are they targeting static troops, they're targeting helicopters as they are moving as well. They're targeting armored vehicles. They're using FPVs to conduct coordinated attacks against isolated outposts to great effect here, causing IDF forces to have to pull back. They're pairing this with rocket fires and small arms fire from forces maneuvering on the ground here. I mean, this is a different type of Hezbollah that I'm used to, covering here. And the IDF has been suffering for it here. Now, obviously, I wouldn't say the IDF has is not put necessarily their whole operation on the back foot, but it has definitely given military and civilian more so military decision makers pause. And we're beginning to see reports of kind of a growing rift between the military decision makers and the civilian, those being Bibi and his cabinet, kind of on saying, okay, what are the battlefield goals here at the operational and more importantly, the tactical level here, and what are we still doing here? Because at some point, we need to realize some sort of success, some sort of ceasefire, and or we just need to leave here. And there's reports increasing that this conversation is getting louder and louder. But I think the biggest news has in the past 48 hours, but also the past couple months has been Hezbollah's use of FPV drones and their use of them to great effect.
So I guess one of the interesting aspects, though, is on this, right, is I guess my question from the FPV drone is, we're seeing casualties go up within the IDF. But I guess my question for you, John, is this a situation where maybe the Hezbollah is actually having an ability to prevent IDF advancements in southern Lebanon? Or is this similar to the IEDs where, obviously they're able, like the U.S. and Iraq and Afghanistan, where the U.S. was able to seize territory, launch successful offensive operations, but casualties were higher simply because of IEDs? Is that kind of where the FPF? So basically, in southern Lebanon with the IDF, is it really hampering IDF's offensive operations in southern Lebanon, or is it just kind of increasing the casualties, but not really having a large detriment effect of combat effectiveness of the IDF?
I think at the operational level, I don't think it's really hampering them. I think what the IDF, when they get a directive, when they get direction, and what they're set out to go do, they're largely realizing these goals, right? When they get direction to go push past X line, let's say when they were told to push past the Litani River X amount of kilometers, they went and did that. But it's the amount of casualties that they're taking for these gains is increasing now here, and that's what I was talking about, how it's giving them pause here now. And so I don't think it's hampering them realizing their operational goals here, but they're beginning to hurt more for it, and obviously that's going to increase the frequency of these conversations that I mentioned earlier about, kind of what are we doing here and how long are we going to be doing it.
Right. I mean, it's interesting, though, that the casualties that the IDF have suffered in southern Lebanon, and correct me if I'm wrong, are still below the 2006 level, right? And it does look like the IDF has applied a lot of lessons learned from the 2006 war in their ability to launch offensive operations in southern Lebanon and their strike capabilities in their airstrikes and degradation. So, is this a situation, John, for Hezbollah where it might be too little, too late? Or is there an ability to increase the cost, increase the casualties, and really put political pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu to change course or find a win and pull the IDF out?
So if their goal is to kind of like totally reverse the IDF's kind of momentum here, yeah, I would say it's too little, too late. But when it comes to inflicting kind of political loss, I mean, every time an IDF soldier dies, the conversation will come up again. Hey, how many more of these casualties is the public willing to take here? Obviously, the public still has a say here, and Netanyahu, as you just mentioned, is still under a lot of political fire domestically here, right? I think the best assessment so far right now is that one of the primary reasons he's continuing to expand operations in Gaza, in the West Bank, in southern Lebanon, one of his many primary reasons is that he's able to cite ongoing national security, quote unquote, crises as his reasonings for skipping out on judicial hearings and Knesset hearings and other such hearings that are supposed to bring him to some level of accountability for some of his actions domestically that he's taken against his political enemies and other areas of the political spectrum here. And so I do think that there is a hope within Hezbollah's leadership that they can continue to make it costly enough that the political fervor rises even more against Bibi.
It's interesting, right? I mean, if you look at IDF operations in Gaza, those continue. We continue to see reports of airstrikes and operations targeting the Palestinian Islamic Jihad and Hamas. But I think even if you look at Gaza, where we've seen even higher level intensity of combat operations by the IDF in Gaza, they still haven't been able to militarily defeat Hamas and the PIJ. I mean, obviously they've been significantly degraded. what is, maybe not from a political perspective, because that's a very hard conversation, but if you're from the IDF perspective, I mean, what is the goal, do you think, for the IDF? Is it limited to Southern Litani River, where they want to destroy Hamas's infrastructure, military capabilities south the Litani River? Is it maybe making Hezbollah similar to what Hamas is right now? I mean, Hamas, for all intents and purposes, just as a ragtag group of insurgent groups, really incapable of doing really much in the Gaza Strip against the IDF outside of simple harassing attacks. Is the goal now for the IDF to achieve that against Hezbollah? And now that the reasonings why higher levels of casualties going on, because now they're facing the regular Hezbollah ground troops, not just the Radwan forces, or the rocket forces, the drone forces. And these are organizations that have deeper embedded capabilities to conduct sophisticated attacks. So is the IDF trying to degrade Hezbollah to a point where it's just like Hamas and Gaza ragtag militia? What do you think is the IDF's goal right now in southern Lebanon, or Lebanon as a whole?
Yeah, right. I mean, so if you take, what Bibi says at face value, that is the goal, to degrade them significantly and then to ultimately defeat them. Now, I think you and I both know as much as anybody else that that's not necessarily going to happen, because they didn't do that to Hamas with the sustained level of bombing and the ground campaigns as they did in the Gaza Strip. This is not going to happen to Hezbollah, as entrenched as they are in Lebanon, who is, and they're even more entrenched in Lebanon than Hamas was and still is in the Gaza Strip. And I think this is where kind of the U.S. track of negotiations kind of comes into this, where I think the U.S. is the one who kind of understands that the only way you get rid of an entrenched group like Hezbollah, I mean, they're not only physically entrenched in there, they're also politically entrenched in Lebanon as well, is from the inside out. Right, you're not going to go in and get rid of Hezbollah. And then that's why we kind of see them negotiating directly with the Lebanese government. And I think some people are confused. Why aren't you negotiating directly with Hezbollah? Because it's the Lebanese government who's ultimately going to be the ones to push them out, at least politically, because you have to do both. Now, if Israel really was going to go in physically and get rid of Hezbollah, they'd have to go in and invade the whole nation, because Hezbollah has there's other Lebanese Hezbollah strongholds throughout the nation. The Bekaa Valley comes to mind, where they have large storehouses of kind of their more indirect fires up there, and they have a number of command posts up there that they can reconstitute at will. And we continue to see Israeli strikes as recent as 2 days ago in the Bekaa Valley region of Lebanon, and so. You're not, the last time Israel tried a ground operation in the Bekaa Valley region, they got, for lack of a better term, ratioed by rocket fire, and they ended up having to pull out after taking a number of casualties here. And so there's still areas within Lebanon where Hezbollah is heavily entrenched, not just in certain neighborhoods in Beirut, not just in the Bekaa Valley, all over Lebanon. And so Israel's not going to be able to just go in there and get them out of here. And so that's why I've always been skeptical of, Netanyahu saying, hey, we're just going to go in there and get rid of them, because you're not going to be able to do that here. And so this is where the question of, well, what are the actual goals here? And that's where I kind of come back around to, it's really just a political thing, I think, for Bibi here. And that's, once again, the conversation comes up of this kind of divide between civilian and military decision makers on, okay, what are actually our operational goals here? And the bigger question, are they achievable?
It's interesting, because I was looking at the kind of the casualty figures from the, obviously we can look at Israel's operations in Lebanon as a continuous aspect since 2023, right? October 7th, 2023, because Israel quickly started conducting strikes in Lebanon shortly after that. Hezbollah didn't get really committed into that. But if we look at the two main aspects of the ground operations that Israel has done in southern Lebanon, you would have to look at 2024, which lasted approximately 2 months, and now this latest iteration where we're entering our third month, right, in 2026. In 2024, there was a ceasefire in place. Obviously, Israel continued to conduct airstrikes at will, has never really stopped. Same here in 2026 with the ground operations. And it's interesting, when we're talking about the ceasefires, it's almost as if the ceasefires really just talk about ground operations, but from an Israeli Air Force, they operate as they see fit. But the casualties right now, even though the offensive operation has lasted longer, is less than what it was in 2024, right? So in 2024, there was about 60 IDF soldiers were killed in southern Lebanon. Right now, we're just over 35. Israeli soldiers were killed by Hezbollah. I think what's noteworthy is the FPV drone use and Hezbollah's ability now to release those images on social media. Obviously, the FPV drone is a harder system to intercept. The trophy systems that the Israelis developed was not designed really for FPVs. They were more designed against RPGs. So obviously, there's going to have to be new capabilities, but it's still less. And some of these offensive operations are much more expansive than 2024. But we've also seen very intense battles going on in southern Lebanon. I guess the question, though, is, you know, before the MOU was signed, after the United States conducted multiple days of strikes in Iran, Israel conducted a strike in Beirut, which was one of Iran's red line. And it looked like President Trump put political pressure and negotiations and maybe some tacit concessions to Iran so that they wouldn't retaliate against Israel. Obviously, because if Iran had conducted a strike against Israel, more than likely it would be very difficult for President Trump to kind of tell Benjamin Netanyahu not to retaliate. We saw 2 days of strikes over a weekend that Israel did against Iran, which were pretty extensive and pretty impactful. And that probably would have derailed the MOU. But where the U.S.'s perspective, there is an additional level of negotiations going on between the Lebanese government and the Israeli governments. And we talked about this in our previous episode, where it looks like President Trump is trying to get Israel and Lebanon to reach an agreement, which there's a broad understanding that Hezbollah would have to disarm, but that's separate from obviously the Iran MOU component, which is a separate track of negotiations. Do you think Hezbollah would ever acquiesce? Let's just pretend, John, that Lebanon and Israel sign an agreement for, let's say, a treaty, maybe normalization of relations, but the stipulation, the requirement is that Hezbollah has to pull out of southern Lebanon, right? Do you believe there is a realm of possibility where Hezbollah would acquiesce to the Lebanese government saying, look, we signed this agreement, you have to pull out. We want to have normalizations with Israel. Is that possible, or would Hezbollah just straight up veto that and say that is not possible?
Yeah, I personally don't think that's possible here. I don't see Hezbollah doing that, seeing as their sole goal, or at least acceding to that willingly, seeing as one of their sole, kind of edicts is to kind of combat the state of Israel here. I just don't see them doing that here. Also, a lot of their center of gravity is their strike capability against Israel, and they wouldn't want to lose that here. I personally don't believe here. They have longer range fires here, but they're limited, and they largely rely on the shorter and mid range rockets to strike northern Israel, and they kind of use that as kind of a thing to hang over Israel's head, and they have consistently used that, and we see them using it now. And I just don't personally, I don't see them doing that here. And, part of their other part of the center of gravity is their political entrenchment within the Lebanese not judicial, the Lebanese legislative system and elsewhere across Lebanon. But their military component is really the heavier part of the center of gravity. I just don't see them doing that here. Now, is there a possibility that the Lebanese government tells them, hey, you need to leave, and they don't, and then the Lebanese army begins a concerted effort to push them out? I think that's something that we could see in the future, and I do think that's something that the United States would push the Lebanese government to do. Now, that's assuming that the Lebanese government is still as comfortable as working directly with the U.S. as the current Lebanese presidency is. So
you think there is a realm of possibility where the Lebanese government might dictate to the military, okay, we have to physically remove Hezbollah from southern Lebanon because of an agreement with Israel, the United States, or maybe the United Nations Security Council resolution is required to get adopted. You think the Lebanese government would do that? So then I guess, three questions to that. One, you said you suspect the U.S. would support such an effort. So just if you could expand on that, if you think that's the case. Number two, the second question then would be UNIFIL. What do you think the UN does? Would they be part of this, or would they take a backseat? And then number three, do you think Hezbollah would fight back, or the political pressure is so intense that they say, okay, we can't fight against the Lebanese military because in the end of the day, these are brethren, and we just won't fight back. Similar to the collapse of the Southern Lebanese army, the pro-Israel group in Southern Lebanon, once the IDF, pulled out, the SLA collapsed. Is there a possibility if the Lebanese military forcefully, not like what we've seen in the past, but forcefully tries to remove Hezbollah presence in Southern Lebanon, that either Hezbollah fights back or they just might melt outside of Southern Lebanon?
Yeah, so I think if they don't melt out, there is a possibility that we could see them forcefully trying to remove them, but that risks the possibility of devolving into an open civil war between Hezbollah and the regular Lebanese army here. And I don't think the Lebanese government wants that. And I think that's heavy on their minds, that possibility as well. And so they don't want to have to do that here. I think the best outcome here is where it's communicated to them, hey, this is what we want you to do. We want you to leave. This is what we're willing to do, talking about forcefully moving them, and then Hezbollah just kind of melts out of southern Lebanon. The only way they do that, however, right, is if Israel withdraws first. That's the only way I see them agreeing to anything like that, if Israel withdraws first. The problem with that is we all kind of know Bibi's track record on saying we're going to withdraw first from a situation here when it's not very good. And I just don't see him allowing the IDF to pull out before Hezbollah officially withdraws there. I think he'd want to see that happen before the IDF presence is gone. And on kind of UNIFIL here, they've kind of just played kind of like a watching role here. They've also taken casualties, been subject to fire, deadly fire from both Hezbollah and the IDF, and they have yet to play kind of a wider role in this, I think, and they've kind of been playing the same role for the past couple of years here in southern Lebanon. Could we see the UN commit to an increase in the force posture down there to kind of keep the peace as this transition is ongoing? I think that's a huge possibility here, but obviously there are some preconditions that would need to be met prior to that. One would be an Israeli agreement to withdraw, and then that coupled with the Hezbollah agreement to withdraw north as the Israelis withdraw south.
So I think there's a lot of key components here that are missing. Before we go to Russia, Ukraine, I would like to ask you one last question on this. We see President Trump, even today, right before we went live, talking about on True Social, and we've seen Trump administration officials kind of repeat this talking point, really highlighting the degradation of the Iranian military, right? The Navy has been destroyed. The Air Force has largely been degraded, if not destroyed. Degradation within the ballistic missile force, the drone force, their air defense. From a purely military side, what's your assessment of the Iranian power projection capability and their military capability, both from the regular army and the IRGC? Do you agree with that assessment, that they've suffered significant degradation? And do you think that has long-lasting effects for Iran's national security interests?
Yeah, I think globally their power projection is basically in the dumps here, right? They don't have a navy anymore, really. All their large surface combatants, both large, medium, and small surface combatants, well, not small, large and medium surface combatants are either at the bottom of a body of water or half at the bottom of a body of water. They still maintain some large surface combatants, obviously, but their ability to project any power globally, I mean, the minimum that they had before is now gone. And we saw them beginning to try and make a lot of these kind of helicopter carriers and drone carriers here. A number of those were destroyed as well. Their air force has been significantly degraded as well, but their center of gravity still largely remains, as I understand, 75% of it is intact, and that's their ballistic cruise missile, and drone fleets, not fleets, but their stockpiles of ballistic missile, cruise missiles, and drones. And the U.S. has been and was unable to kind of effectively degrade that due to the nature of where they're stockpiled at, which is these very deep bunkers. We saw the U.S. striking the entrances to the launching points and the entrances to these bunkers multiple times, trying to bury them in. They would dig them out. They would come out, launch, and then go right back in. The U.S. would strike it, and the cycle would repeat over and over and over and over again. With some things saying that there were, dozens of munitions used against the same entrance within, a couple days period. Um, uh, so I think largely their ability to project power though in the region, which is really where they're more focused, still remains intact, right? We've seen them do it already since the end of the official 40-day war, right? We've already seen them do it, right? When they say, "Hey, we're going to do this, don't do this, or we'll respond." They struck Israel, right? Or they began to strike Gulf nations again. And there's right now nothing that indicates to me that they are unable to begin to strike not only Israel, but also U.S. bases and infrastructure and their Gulf neighbors at the same tempo that they were during the height of the 40-day war. So I think from a global perspective, any global aspirations or power projecting that they did have that they were beginning to realize, those are gone, totally gone. And I do think they have realized significant degradation to their conventional military, but their center of gravity, which has always been uh, their ballistic and cruise missile and drone stockpiles, largely remains the same as the current assessments have that still standing at 75% intact.
Well, yeah, we do. Well, I would just, there has been some varied degrees of assessments. I think one of them was 75%. Some of them said two-thirds, 66%. I mean, President Trump has said 20%, but take that the wide range. But there has been areas where it's much more significant. I would just highlight that during. I mean, if you talk to anybody who was in the 1991 Gulf War, what they would say is scud hunting, which is basically the ballistic missile force that the Iraqi government had, was a very difficult, if not nearly impossible task, and that's why you try to avoid scud hunting. The production capabilities of the Iranian ballistic missile force and drone force have been severely targeted and degraded. There has been some reporting that they're trying to rebuild that. It looks like the drone aspect would have been much more easy. It's easier for them to rebuild their drone production lines compared to the ballistic missile lines. Where I would, I guess, somewhat disagree with you, John, though, is kind of like these ballistic missiles and drones. I mean, what we saw that they did against Israel during the ceasefire and prior to the MOU being signed was not very significant. It really did not have a significant impact. And then how the Israelis and the IDF responded was, I mean, you can make the argument it was disproportional from the Israeli response, that they took advantage of the strikes that the ballistic missiles that the Iranians launched, and they didn't really have that much of an impact. And even some of these other areas where we've seen strikes, I mean, some of them, it looks like much more symbolic significance, but from a military component, not much, because let's look at the U.S. military presence right now in the Middle East. We get all these satellite images. Al Dhafra was hit significantly. Ayudid Air Base was hit. Navcent was hit. Kuwait was hit during the 40-day war. But the U.S. military is still operating out of those bases since the ceasefire. I mean, a lot of the refueling aircrafts are launching out of Al Dhafra Air Base. So it does show that even though the center of gravity continues to have that, from a military component, they really didn't have the ability to dent U.S. military power projections and air power across the region and command and control across the region, which in the end of the day should be Iran's primary goal in utilizing their ballistic missile force.
Yeah, so yeah, I'm not necessarily saying that the U.S. or Israel took a disproportionate, took more damage than Iran did. I 100% agree that from a military standpoint, Iran took way more damage, and if you from a win and lose perspective, they lost that portion of the war, right? But I do think they maintain the ability to conduct what their outlook is, right? So if they want to close the strait, all they have to do is fire a couple of missiles into the Strait of Hormuz. They still retain the capability to do that. If they want to threaten other straits like the Bab el-Mandeb, they still maintain the capability and the ability to impress upon their allies in the region, non-state and non-state actors, specifically, obviously, the Houthis in Yemen, to close down that strait by doing the exact same thing by firing a couple missiles into the Strait of Hormuz. They don't actually have to have a lot of good effects on targets to realize some of their goals here. And I think the Iranians learned that from the Houthis firing off missiles into the Bab last year. They learned that, hey, we can do the same thing in the Hormuz Strait and it'll get closed down immediately. No one's going to want to still ship through there. Insurance will skyrocket, and it's an even more strategic. As oil is concerned, it's more strategic than the Bab, right? And so I think they're still able to realize some of their goals or much of their goals with the force that they currently maintain here. Now, what they were going to do with things like their Navy and other things, it remains to be seen. There's not much the Navy was ever going to do, especially when going up against a force that I wouldn't even call a peer force like the United States and or Israel that maintains long-range precision fires, multiple capital ships in the region that absolutely just devastated them, not only there, but also in the Indian Ocean as well. Yeah, so I'm not necessarily trying to say that the U.S. took the worst of it. Iran definitely took the worst of it, but they still maintain the ability to kind of do what they want to do in the region, but not necessarily globally.
Yeah, I think the aspect is, there's some aspects of the Iranian military which is, I guess, was more for show, and then one of the Iranian military was more for a conventional military force and capabilities, right? And I have just a personal pet peeve of mine is when people talk about the Iranian ballistic missile, cruise missile, and drone program, and they kind of frame it as this asymmetrical capability, and it's like, guys, that's not. That is literally the definition of a conventional military force. I mean, that's deep strike capabilities. I mean, that is as conventional can be. I think people just throw asymmetric out there willy-nilly without fully, truly understanding what it actually means and how the Iranians built their ballistic missile force, specifically the Al Gadir Missile Command, was to have a conventional deterrence and a conventional strike capabilities because they understood they couldn't have parity in any other aspects, right? I guess the last thing before we go to Russia Ukraine is the other component of Iran's power projection capability is their proxy network. The last episode we talked about how it looked like some pro-Iranian Iraqi militia groups in Iraq announced that they were leaving the PMF and that they agreed that their weapons should be handed over to the Iraqi state. So broadly speaking, how does the axis of resistance look like now compared to October 7th, 2023? And even with Iraq, with these groups announcing that they might be leaving the PMF, is that another dent in Iran's expeditionary force?
I think the only real dent was to Hezbollah, and that came prior to the 40-day war, right? When Israel kind of systematically went up their chain of command and command structure and devastated it, and that ended with the killing of Hassan Nasrallah. I think that kind of already happened. That they kind of already took that dent. Since then, I have yet to really see the Houthis have not been defeated. The Houthis still maintain their kind of sovereignty over the
right. But why didn't the Houthis get involved?
And this has been the interesting thing here, right? Because how much of an axis of resistance do they really have if, for lack of a better term, your new principal, I mean, not lack of a better term, but for, all intents and purposes, the Houthis are now, their primary non-state actor in the region. And I like to personally classify the Houthis as a state actor, right? They sort of act like when they have the power, they have the funds to be one. And they hold the seat of power in Yemen and have for a while now. The Houthis didn't get involved, I think, because the Houthis were reticent to have the U.S. beggar their economic capabilities in the same way we did last time. The Houthis themselves said that they suffered significantly from an economic standpoint during last year's joint U.S.-Israeli strikes against their oil infrastructure, and I think the Houthis were reticent to do that here as well. Now, is that evidence that Iran pushed then, requested that, hey, can you threaten the BAB? And they just said outright no? I don't know yet, but I do think that Houthis did give some pushback to Iranian decision makers that they were talking to and or working with, IRGC decision makers, when it came to closing down the BAB, because we constantly saw Iran threaten that, hey, if these red lines are crossed, we're gonna, or if they doing the strike campaigns, if the Israelis and or the U.S. does this, we're gonna and I think that and then it never happened, right? The BAB was never threatened here, and I'm glad it was never threatened, but that is one interesting thing here. But I think the important thing though is the Houthis remain intact, but also so does their framework within Iraq and other areas in the Gulf here. And you mentioned kind of the situation with the PMF that's ongoing. And so this has been an interesting thing because the U.S. has continued to pressure the Iraqi government to kind of get a handle on the Iranian-backed non-state actors that are kind of worked into their military command structure and their paramilitary command structure. And this has kind of always been something that was always going to hamper the Iraqi government in kind of realizing its own independent outlook, whether it was independent of the U.S., but more importantly, independent of Iran here, because Iran their influence is so deeply seated inside of the Iraqi government here. And so when the Iraqi government is now saying, hey, you guys need to turn over your arms to us or subordinate them to our, or subordinate yourselves directly under our command. And that's why we're beginning to see these groups splinter off from the PMF, because these are the more hardline Iranian-backed groups subordinate to the PMF. Because you know as well as I do that the PMF is not just kind of one group; it's kind of an amalgamation of multiple different groups, largely Iranian-backed here. And I think this is Iran exercising its continued control over some of these groups within the PMF, and other groups as well that are subordinate to the Iraqi military command, by seeing these groups splinter off, saying, "Hey, we're not willing to do that because we know exactly what that means. You're exercising this control over us, whereas we lose the agency to act on the behalf of Iran." So, and this is something I assessed like more than a year ago, that the U.S. was gonna have a very, very hard time at divorcing the Iranian-backed groups from the Iraqi military command structure, because of how deep-seated and how deeply ingrained, that they are into that command structure, and just into the general structure of the Iraqi military. The Iraqi military relied on a lot of these groups to fight off ISIS, and Iran used that reliance and that increasing reliance during that period to kind of get their tendrils into the Iraqi government, and it worked perfectly. And here we are today, kind of in this situation. So I think the wider axis of resistance, save Hezbollah and obviously Hamas, it largely remains intact. And so Iran still maintains the ability to use them as an executor of their regional strategic outlook. Now the Houthis I believe personally that the Houthis not conducting strikes in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait was possibly an anomaly here. Now, would they be willing to do it if they are directly threatened? I think if they were directly threatened preemptively, we'd see the Houthis begin to conduct some type of strikes like that. But I think the Houthis, and I've said this before, I think on this podcast, that the Houthis have been Iran's kind of greatest success and also their greatest failure, because they gained such a certain amount of agency, because they became so powerful that they have the ability to tell Iran, hey, well, we don't necessarily want to do that because it may hurt us more than it benefits us.
So I guess then the assessment is they still have it, but the Shia crescent that King Abdullah of Jordan said years ago, for all intents and purposes, it looks like it's crumbled, if not in the verge of collapsing in many aspects. And it's now much more inward looking, with maybe an extension in the Houthis, who are not as reliable as others, or not, maybe reliable is not the term, so beholden to Iran, let's say, compared to Hezbollah. But I do want to kind of finish off this episode with you, John, talking about the situation in Russia, Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine has been conducting very successful drone strikes across Russia and in Russia-occupied Ukraine. There is a significant fuel shortage in Crimea right now, with reports that Russian government officials are either considering or have already outright banned sale of fuel to private citizens in Crimea. Within the last couple of days, Iran has launched reportedly the largest drone strike against Moscow, specifically involving hundreds of drones that targeted, oil refineries and oil infrastructure. What is the situation from a military side in Russia, Ukraine? Is the fuel crisis as bad as it's being reported? And if it is as bad, is it widespread in many areas, or kind of just local and focused on Crimea?
Yeah, I don't believe it's only focused on Crimea. Ukraine has been conducting strikes across a wide range of energy infrastructure across Russia. But in the past couple of days, we've seen a return to kind of a concerted effort to focus on Crimea here. One thing that I also want to specifically mention, too, not necessarily focus on the energy, but it's also focused on kind of the situation in Russian rear areas, is there strikes on some of the ferries that cross the Kerch Strait in lieu of the bridge, because they've also been targeting that as well. They targeted at least 4 ferries yesterday in the past 48 hours. And these are key kind of modes of transportation to transport, whether it's fuel trucks or just other military hardware across the strait, so that they can avoid that bridge there, because it's heavily targeted by Ukrainian drones here. And I'd only expect to see operations like that increase here. Now, the fuel shortages in Crimea, as far as I can understand, both Russian and Ukrainian sourcing has fuel shortages there extremely bad, to the point of after the most recent strikes, fuel is essentially cut off, and gas stations are apparently reportedly, this is reports that I've seen just in the past hour, so I can't confirm this, are no longer servicing people. This is in the past day. That's how bad the fuel shortage is here. We've seen commensurate statements from the acting kind of governor of Crimea, the Russian kind of puppet there, as well here. And then the fuel shortage is extremely bad here, and so Russia is the people in Crimea are going to be looking to the Russian government to kind of remedy the situation fast. Now, kind of the implications this has for the battlefield here, right? Obviously, the Ukrainians aren't going to conduct some kind of lightning offensive deep into Crimea, but what this will do is it will beggar Russia's ability to support Crimea here, right? And so, if the Ukraine can continue to compound on such successes, this will increase increase Russia's war weariness, but increases the bad situation in their rear areas. Now, if you switch to other axes of kind of attack from Ukraine elsewhere, kind of the more deep strikes into Russia proper here, they're also beginning to beggar Russia's oil industry, which at the same time has had the adverse effect of we're seeing more reports that Russian elites are beginning to get more tired of this war, as their industries, as their companies are beginning to suffer directly from this war more in a more kinetic manner, let's say. I've been personally focused on the Iran war more, but this is something that being kind of working for an aggregate like OSINT Defender, obviously we're pushing out these reports as well too, so I'm seeing these as well. And it is an interesting thing, because 2 years ago, if you had told me that Ukraine's defense industry was going to be able to scale up to be launching sometimes near daily, large scale strikes against Russia proper, I tell you're insane. And you're as I'm about pro-Ukrainian as the next guy, but you might be getting a little ahead of yourselves. And in the past 2 years, we've seen Ukraine be able to upscale their industry, not only to be able to support such strikes, but to also be able to now get the okay from the government to begin to export to other nations as well here. And this is something that's huge here, because Ukraine now has excess of military components and drones and things to export now, because and they're still able to launch these large scale strikes against Russia that are only increasing here. And more importantly, the effectiveness is also increasing as well, and the effects on target. So, I mean, in the short term here, I don't see Ukraine trying to capitalize off this, from the ground in any way. I think they're going to continue to compound on what they do best at right now, which is these strikes here, and to continue to use these strikes and these kind of and the effectiveness of these strikes to beggar Russia's ability to supply their forces, Russia's ability to supply their own people as well, and then the Russian kind of war weariness that we're increasingly hearing more about. And the last thing I'd like to add on that is, I'm always the person who's always saying, hey, I'm tired of hearing that every 6 months that the Russian economy is going to fail. I'm that guy who's going to tell you it's not going to fail. But if Ukraine is able to keep up the tempo of these strikes and or increase them, who knows what could happen here in the near future, because at some point, they're going to beggar Russia's economy to a point where serious decisions are going to have to be made by Putin and or the people surrounding him.
But what I would say is very interesting how you framed it in the beginning, because I was focusing on the fuel crisis in Crimea, and what you pointed out, I think, in a better aspect, is the Ukrainian ability to target the supply lines of the Russians, their logistics, right? But I think we've kind of said this broadly and kind of touched upon it. But what we've seen the Ukrainians do with drones, which is, I think, is, again, what you said, we'd had this conversation years ago, I wouldn't have believed it. One, at the tactical level, right now, estimates are about 35,000 Russian casualties every month inside of Ukraine. The vast majority of them done by Ukrainian drones. So that's at the tactical, and the vast majority of those casualties the Ukrainians will acknowledge is at the tactical level, at the front line, near the front lines, within a certain distance within the front lines, 10, 20 kilometers, even less, if not even a couple kilometers with the FPV drones, right? So that's at the tactical aspect. At the operational side, we've alluded to and kind of highlighted this is the successful strike campaign in Russia occupied Ukraine, specifically, these ferries you identified, the fuel trucks, the fuel lines, a lot of these supply routes deeper inside of Ukraine. The Ukrainians have been able to really target a lot of these logistics lines and these logistical convoys that are having a significant impact on Russia's positions inside of Crimea, where now the question is, it's almost like Crimea is becoming a liability for the Russians, right? And that at the strategic side, which is the other aspect of the strike campaign, what we talked about, is these deep Ukrainian, not even almost, this daily large-scale strikes targeting energy infrastructure, oil infrastructure, even military infrastructures inside of Russian territory. And what this shows is that the Ukrainians have achieved something that I think has been the goal, but they managed to do that with drone, which is unique. Which is, it's almost, we might have to have a conversation, John, is saying the Ukrainians have achieved what the U.S. does with air power, right? In the sense that the U.S. Air Force gains air supremacy to then conduct deep strikes across an enemy target. We saw it in Iran very successfully, the tactical and the operational aspect, right? The U.S. Air Force and the U.S. Navy and even the U.S. Army with ATACMS and the ballistic missile, rocket force with ATACMS, et cetera, and PRISMs, were able to achieve enormous success at degrading the Iranians and destroying their air defense, their air force, their navy, their production sites, et cetera, right? But they use that with manned equipment. And it's almost like the Ukrainians, after 4 years of constant war, have achieved that with drones. 35,000 casualties a month in the front lines. Severe fuel shortages in Crimea at the operational level. And now at the strategic side, we're having this significant strike campaign. Has Ukraine, John, achieved what many thought was necessary for the Ukrainians? They needed to get to this level to have basically a full cycle, close, deep fight against the Russians utilizing drones. Because how I'm looking at it, it looks like the Ukrainians are, if not there already, not that far off.
Yeah, I largely agree. I wouldn't necessarily characterize it as air supremacy, though. And I
no,
don't.
No, not the air supremacy. That was like let me rephrase that. That's how you and I would agree the U.S. Air Force doctrine is you use the Air Force to do deep strikes, right? So, but to get there, generally you do, unless initial strikes with standoff weapons, the ultimate goal of the Air Force is to gain air supremacy because you want consistent, persistent air coverage to not only do deliberate strikes, but ideally dynamic strikes. But to be the ability to do dynamic strikes, you require air supremacy. That then enables you to do these air operations where now you ideally want to get to dynamic strikes to continue to chip off the capabilities of the enemies. Because let's remember, John, right? Like prior to the strike campaign that the Ukrainians did against the supply lines and the logistics, the Ukrainians were in the last before this, months ago, and even last year, what was the priority? Was the Russian air defense system, specifically the SHORAD systems, because they understood the SHORADs were the main impediments for Ukrainian drones. It was the SHORADs, and the Ukrainians would constantly announce SHORAD destruction. They showed that they had a capability. It took them a lot longer than the U.S. probably did in Iran, but eventually they got there. That now moved them to the next area. So in the construct of the drone capability, yeah, it's not necessarily air supremacy, obviously not. We can't use that per se, but it has almost become a semi, if not pretty permissible environment for Ukrainian drones to operate freely, not only in Russia, but more importantly in Russia-occupied Ukraine. And they managed to achieve this all with drones.
Yeah. And in that sense, then I do definitely agree here. And then one thing that's more, I compound on that by saying, if you've seen the advancements, I know you've seen the advancements that they've made in kind of the more standoff technology, right? I guess you could call drone standoff, but more like standoff munitions, that is, right? Cruise missiles, ballistic missiles here. The jumps and leaps that they made just in the past year has been significant. Now we see the UK is now willing to collaborate with them on the development of cruise missiles as well. Here, Ukraine's standoff strike capabilities, right, is only growing here, and I think their ability, right, as kind of you characterize it, the ability to kind of realize this level of air supremacy by being able to conduct strikes at enemy targets at the operational and tactical level when and more importantly, where and more importantly, when you want is huge here. And we've seen Ukraine been able to do that increasingly, and with increasing effect throughout the years. I think we all remember the first couple waves of Ukrainian drone strike campaigns against Russia, and they were really kind of haphazard and piecemeal. And now, like you said, it's a near daily wave of Ukrainian drones that's going out all across from Ukraine. I mean, they're simultaneously hitting Crimea and hundreds of targets inside Russia proper. They're hitting Moscow on a weekly basis as well. Here, this is something I never thought I'd see here, and I
mean, and that's
definitely
just completely ignoring the tactical aspect, which is very, very, very consistent. I mean, it's definitely I think there's a lot of lessons learned, especially if you're Taiwan. I would just tell people before the reason why Ukraine was able to get to this point right now is at the beginning of this war, when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2002, the Ukrainian military and through mass mobilization were able to hamper and defeat the Russians' lightning offensive, utilizing conventional force without the drones. And then once it got to a point of stalemate, the Ukrainians identified drones as being the future and really exploit that to the max. But I think one of the things you kind of pointed out to was something that I would agree on, which was kind of the issue, is that we have seen the Ukrainians have very local, maybe tactical counteroffensive success. We have seen the Ukrainians, a couple months, I believe it was April, the Russians lost more territory than they were able to take for the first time in a couple of years. But I mean, we're talking about very small, localized counteroffensive at the tactical level. I would agree with you that the main issue that the Ukrainians have as manpower, and they're not able to translate all this into operational level breakthroughs using maneuver warfare. And it's almost like at least right now, the sensation is what the Ukrainians are trying to increase the cost to the Russians to force them to give up, which, it is a military strategy, but at the end of the day, you're beholden on the Russians' will to fight, which is one of the hardest things to measure and assess. It's almost as if though you don't necessarily have the initiative to put your own will based on facts on the ground there. Do you think that maybe the Ukrainians are going to expand this strike campaign and this degradation so that eventually they might be able to launch maybe at least one operational offensive, maybe something similar to what we saw in the failed counteroffensive of 2023? Or is this drone campaign and what we're seeing right now the way the Ukrainians are going to fight, and we should not expect the Ukrainians to launch anything outside of small, localized counteroffensives?
Yeah, just today I was talking with the team at Ocean Defender exactly about that, and then that was just kind of the consensus here is the latter of those two options here. I think that they're going to kind of sit back, be willing to degrade the Russian rear areas and Russian energy sector as much as they possibly can, and then see if the Russians will make take any decisions to either withdraw or shorten the line of contact, or withdraw from the certain lines of contact to make it more tenable for them to hold the line of contact, just based off of the degradation of their rear areas and also other areas like their energy sector as well. I think the only area where we're going to see something like this happen, I think that where the likeliest possibility of this happening is, as you mentioned, was the topic we were talking about before, which is Crimea here. I think it's the easiest one to do that because of its relative isolation to obviously Russia proper here, and the ability of Ukraine to the ability that they've already exercised to be able to isolate Crimea, not only from military hardware, but also fuel as well here. So I think it's the latter. I think that Ukraine is, so as of right now, that's pending any type of major decisions on manpower or mobilization efforts here. I think that Ukrainian military and civilian decision makers are willing to sit back and kind of degrade Russia's rear areas and their energy capacity as much as possible. And then also at the tactical level, like you mentioned here, continue to just grind down Russian forces as much as possible. Because obviously, while, Putin does have a bigger manpower pool to pull on, it still does look bad if he has to continue to increase mobilization or to continue to go to the North Koreans or somebody or a third party like that to kind of help them fight this war.
Well, John, I really want to thank you for providing broad-based analysis. I mean, we've been going at this over an hour now. And I think we talked about a lot of important issues. We talked about the situation in the Middle East, Iran, the negotiations, Lebanon, Hezbollah, Israel, the IDF, and then ended with Russia, Ukraine, and kind of these drone deep strike campaigns that the Ukrainians have really been able to maximize and take advantage of. So I think this has been a phenomenal conversation. I would love to have you back next week to also talk about the situation in Latin America from a geopolitical and military component. We'll have other speakers on as well to kind of cover about this, because I think this kind of fits within a broader picture of U.S. national security that we're seeing with the Western Hemisphere and the elections in Colombia, really solidifying U.S. influence and interest in Latin America. So thank you very much, John, for joining us. To our listeners, this has been a great conversation where we expanded on last week's and a lot of additional things. We will continue to monitor the situation in the Middle East in case there are any additional breaking news, and we will make sure to share them here as they occur. But until then, this has been The Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast. Thank you, and see you soon.